We're going to continue on with a talk from Jerrad Goodell. Jerrad is joining us from the Green River District in Utah, where he is a fisheries biologist. And Jerrad is going to talk to us about priority stressors and stream systems out there, how they're implementing kind of a collaborative process with various stakeholders to understand some water quality exceedances.
Yeah, so as Scott mentioned, that's what I'll be talking about. And I just want to stress that the collaborative monitoring is really important for achieving these goals that we're setting out to do. First off, a brief background on the BLM land health standards. If you're here in the room for the other talks or the last talk, you've heard a lot about them, so I'll keep it short. The BLM and managing lands has 4 standards, at least in BLM Utah has 4 standards. One deals with soils, one with plant and wildlife species, the third with stream and wetland conditions, but the one I'm going to talk about deals with water quality. And number 4 states that the BLM will comply with water quality standards established by the state of Utah and the Federal Clean Water Act, and fully support the designated beneficial uses. Those beneficial uses include recreation, agriculture, domestic water, and aquatic life. And as you can see, livestock watering is also one of those uses. Now, we're all here this week to talk about range management, but there are a lot of other activities in our watersheds, including resource extraction through coal, oil, and gas, agriculture and urban development, all of which can affect measurements of land health downstream on public lands. So we wanted to look at a watershed scale to explain the conditions we see on BLM managed streams. The area I'm focusing in on is the central part of Utah around the town of Price and the San Rafael swell area. The next map will show up better, so I don't read too much. The BLM's protocol for assessing streams was implemented in the summers of 2011 and 2012 in this area. And that data suggested that nutrient loading and conductivity levels were well above predicted values. And 65% of that spatial variance was explained by the percent agriculture, the percent ag, and the number of oil and gas wells, along with the amount of hydrological alteration upstream in the watershed. So similar results were found when 2016 data was added. These maps show the nitrogen, phosphorus, and conductivity levels in relation to predicted values, and the red dots show major departure from what the models say we should be seeing. And as you can see, there's a lot of them. And just for reference, kind of running through the middle of the map is the Green River, this is Desolation Canyon, and you have the Price River, San Rafael. So there were some limitations to that data. The water quality was collected using one-time grab samples during the summer, during low flows, potentially leading to high concentrations. So more temporally intensive sampling was needed to assess if the increased nutrient and conductivity levels were persistent issues. This led to working with the Utah Department of Water Quality in the fall of 2016 to develop a sampling plan for streams in the Price area with the objectives to increase the number of sampling locations and intensity, determine the spatial and temporal extent of water quality impairments, and determine which land uses are most strongly associated with changes in water quality. Specifically, some of our hypothesis for what could be driving that was density of oil and gas wells, canal density, percent agriculture in the watershed, and the geology. So sites were selected based on the previous AIM sampling that showed potential water quality impairments. And also we wanted to isolate input from tributary streams to the larger rivers to determine which of them were the main contributors to the main stem. And then we also tried to focus it where land ownership was switching from predominantly private and Forest Service upstream, and right where it entered BLM, so BLM was all downstream, to see if we're inheriting these problems or is that something that's going on BLM lands. And so once these sites were selected, we did monthly water collection if possible, but a lot of these sites were down 2-track roads, and I'm being generous by calling them 2 tracks. So a lot of times the rain, snow, and mud got in the way, and we just couldn't get out there every month. And then once we had the samples, within 2 days, they were sent to the state lab to be analyzed for nitrogen, phosphorus, total dissolved solids, and several other parameters and metals like selenium and copper. So in the analysis of causal factors, we wanted to focus in on the most problematic issues for the area. So this table shows the stream names, the cause of impairment, and as you can see, a couple of them were impaired due to temperature, and so we put temp loggers out, but we had issues trying to keep them in the water, so that data set was incomplete, and we couldn't really dig into that, but we're trying again, anchoring those loggers in, and hopefully in the future we'll be able to do something with that. And then, as you saw before, the AIM data showed potential high levels of nitrogen, phosphorus, and TDS. And then, as you can see, a lot of these, there's no assessment. It just needs more data, which highlights the need to really work cooperatively to fill in these data gaps, and but also ensure that when the conditions get better, we have follow-up sampling to show that, and the stream is delisted, and BLM's no longer on the hook for having an impaired water. And then I want to point out, like everything talking about the AIM, we were measuring conductivity, but with the state of Utah and the lab samples, it's total dissolved solids. So then we gathered GIS data layers from the USGS, state of Utah, NLCD, and StreamCat for percent ag, oil, and gas wells, and all the other parameters we wanted to look at as possible causes for the elevated in-stream measurements. Then we calculated their number or density in the watershed and compared it to the 75th percentile of phosphorus and total dissolved solids. We did the 75th percentile because we're mainly concerned about those high elevated values. We did not analyze nitrogen because all of those results were below the state standards, but it's something we will look into because they are above background, and we want to be proactive and look into possible causes so we can prevent those from reaching that impairment level. And we can do the same thing for other parameters like boron and selenium. All right, so let's get into the data a little bit. Here are the lab results for phosphorus. Each site is on the x-axis sampled by month with the value on the y-axis. And in Utah, the exceedance value is 0.05 milligrams per liter. And it's kind of hard to see on this graph, but when we zoom in, you can see the majority of the samples were above the exceedance limit. The seasonal pattern is not really clear because several sites with high values in the summer months we couldn't access in the winter due to the snow and road conditions. And so this is great data to have, and the Department of Water Quality will use this to make determinations on whether or not the watershed is impaired. Now, total dissolved solids, it's a little trickier to graph because the exceedance limit varies from stream to stream. So I listed the number of samples taken and the number of exceedances seen, and then the percent of those. And as you see, it was only Coal Creek and Miller Creek that actually went above that level. So I don't know what's up with your creek out there, Scott, but you need to go work on it. But several of these others, even though they weren't above the exceedance, they were right there. They were within 30, 40, 50 microsiemens. So again, we want to be proactive and make sure it doesn't reach that level where we have an impaired water on BLM lands. So let's start getting into some of the results. For all the graphs I'm going to show, on the x-axis is going to be the possible cause we're looking at, and the 75th percentile on the Y. So I'm going to start out with phosphorus, and when we compare that to the density of, the percent agriculture in the area, we really have a really low R-squared value, so not sure what was going on there. So we thought, well, let's look at some other measures of agriculture, and maybe it's there, just showing up with a different signal. So we looked at density of canals, which is not only an indicator of ag land, but also of potential return flows. And again, very little correlation, 0.12. Oil and gas development is a big part of Utah, so we thought that could be a driver. But again, there's very little relationship. So we had to start looking harder and trying to come up with other hypothesis of what could be driving this phosphorus. So we thought, well, maybe it's just part of the natural geology. But when we compare the phosphorus values to the percent phosphorus oxide geology near the surface in the watershed, we still don't see much of a correlation. With more data points, we might get a better R value, or the high phosphorus could just be the result of a land use we haven't looked at yet. So we'll keep continuing to research and come up with some new hypotheses to test to get an idea of what's going on with that. Now to total dissolved solids, where we actually have some good news, well, not good news, but some more correlated results. So when we look at total dissolved solids versus the percent ag, we have an extremely high R-squared value, 0.91. The caveat is the small sample size and that lone high value falling right on the line. So again, we wondered, is this really because of percent ag, or do we just get lucky on these data points? So we also looked at nitrogen fertilizer applied in the watershed, and again, a pretty decent R-squared value, 0.76. So when you combine this with the results from the previous slide, it's a strong indicator that agriculture is a driver of total dissolved solids in our streams. We didn't stop there. We wanted to look at other possible causes like density of canals, which is indicator and return flows. And this was, not as strong a relationship. We're getting down to, 0.52 on that correlation. And then again, with oil and gas being a big part of that field office, we wanted to see what the density of oil and gas wells, and it showed a strong correlation shown by the R value. And so this got us really excited. We actually have something we can work with to improve water quality. And so some of the ways we can improve conditions is working with NRCS to improve irrigation and fertilizer practices on private lands to reduce the amount of salinity and fertilizer runoff from agriculture. In this area of Utah, there are funds available to reduce salinity in the Colorado River, so we can apply for grants to implement private and government projects. There's also an effort to increase the water in the Green River and Lake Powell by paying producers to rotationally fallow fields or reduce their irrigation season. So this results in more in-stream flows, potentially diluting the contaminants and bringing the streams into compliance with land health standards. So the BLM, though, we can also help with this. We have our travel management plans, and we can work hard to reduce the number of redundant roads, like out here in the oil and gas fields. During the NEPA process for drilling, reduce the disturbance. And I think both of those are kind of tied into the relationship we're seeing with oil and gas wells and total dissolved solids. So in the end, we have increased the amount of water quality data available to ourselves and the state of Utah. We focused on some of the higher values, but it was not all bad news out there. For other parameters like copper, aluminum, and arsenic, all of those were well below the state standards. Therefore, the BLM is meeting our land health objectives for several of them, but we have work to do with others like the phosphorus and TDS. Everything discussed so far today could not have been done without cooperation from the Utah Department of Water Quality. the National Aquatic Monitoring Center, and the BLM. Each of us provided our organizational expertise and capacity, and we will continue to dig into this data and find ways to address the water quality impairments, because neither the fault or the solution can be laid on one landowner, agency, or land use. To improve water quality and meet land health standards, we must build partnerships and work across the watershed to improve conditions on our public lands. So a big thanks to all the BLM and NAMC staff who worked on this, especially Robin Jones and Margaret King, the Department of Water Quality, the State Lab, and the Price and Bernal BLM offices who helped people when they got stuck in the mud trying to get these samples. And with that, I'm pretty sure I got time for questions.